Imagine the silence of a medieval square. The crowd presses forward, children perched on shoulders, merchants whispering, priests watching with grim approval. At the center of the square stands not a scaffold, nor a gallows, but something far more sinister. A massive wooden wheel, reinforced with iron, its spokes gleaming in the pale morning light. The condemned lies beside it, trembling, praying, perhaps screaming. And then, an executioner, armed with a heavy iron bar, raises his weapon. The first blow shatters bone. The wheel begins its dreadful work. The breaking wheel, also known simply as the wheel, was more than an execution device. It was a theater of annihilation, where the noose ended life quickly and the sword with a single stroke. The wheel lingered. It promised not just death, but hours, sometimes days, of unspeakable torment. Bones crushed, limbs twisted, flesh torn. A body not just killed, but broken, displayed, and left to rot as a warning to all who might dare challenge the order of their rulers. This was not punishment in the modern sense of law and consequence. This was punishment as a ritualized spectacle, a performance designed to terrify, to instruct, and to reinforce the iron grip of authority. When the wheel appeared, it was not only the criminal who suffered, it was the audience, forced to reckon with the sight of humanity reduced to splintered fragments. And yet, they kept coming. They crowded the squares, they jostled for the best view. They brought their children, they cheered, jeered, and sometimes prayed. But why? Why did societies devise such an apparatus of agony? Why did kings, emperors, and city councils insist that criminals be broken rather than merely executed? To understand the wheel, one must understand the psychology of fear in history. In an age when rulers were fragile, when rebellion and crime threatened the delicate balance of order, fear was power, and nothing instilled fear quite like the wheel. It was not only a punishment for thieves and murderers, it was a symbol, a weapon wielded by authority. To be condemned to the wheel was to be stripped, not just of life, but of dignity, humanity, and memory. The victim became an example, a grotesque warning left to the crows. Over the next hour, we will descend into the dark history of this infamous device. We will trace its bloody origins, dissect its gruesome mechanics, recount the stories of those shattered beneath its spokes, and explore how it became a symbol that haunted both religion and folklore. This is the story of the wheel, not just as an instrument of death, but as a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of human history. The Wheel of Bones has long since ceased to turn in public squares, but its echoes remain, whispering from the annals of history, reminding us how fragile the line is between justice and cruelty, between order and sadism. The wheel may be gone, but its shadow lingers, etched in bone, blood, and memory. The wheel did not emerge fully formed as an execution device. Like so many instruments of cruelty, it evolved from the chaos of war, the brutality of conquest, and the shifting notions of justice in the ancient and medieval world. To understand how a simple wooden wheel became synonymous with agony, we must go back, long before the Middle Ages, to the ancient punishments of Rome and the tribal customs of early Europe. In antiquity, the wheel was not originally a tool of death, but of transport. Wagons carried soldiers, supplies, and loot. Yet in time of war, the very object that symbolized mobility and progress could be turned into a weapon of humiliation. Roman sources describe prisoners of war tied to wagon wheels and dragged through camps as a spectacle of triumph. Others speak of captured rebels executed in ways that crush the body, using wheels as restraints or platforms. To the Romans, execution was never simply about removing a criminal. It was a message carved into flesh. But it was among the Germanic and Frankish tribes that the true roots of the breaking wheel seem to have taken hold. Their laws prescribed punishments that emphasized not only death, but the dismemberment and disfigurement of the body. Among these warrior cultures, the human body itself became a battlefield. A man who broke tribal law might in turn be broken, his body smashed so thoroughly that it could no longer be buried whole. To deny a person an intact burial was, in many pagan and early Christian traditions, to deny them peace in the afterlife. Thus, the act was more than physical destruction. It was spiritual annihilation. By the early Middle Ages, as Europe began to codify laws under kings and emperors, the wheel became formalized. Under the Carolingian Empire in the 8th and 9th centuries, records describe criminals, particularly murderers and thieves, being condemned to the wheel. This was not an execution carried out in haste. It was ritualized. The condemned would be laid out beside a cartwheel, their limbs arranged along the spokes. The executioner would then strike, breaking arms and legs at the joints before weaving the shattered body through the wheel itself. It was grisly efficiency. The wheel both destroyed the body and served as a frame to display it. Why the wheel? Why not the sword, the rope, or fire? Part of the answer lies in symbolism. The wheel has always represented fate. In both pagan and Christian imagery, the wheel of fortune turns endlessly, lifting some men up and casting others down. To die upon a wheel was to be trapped in that symbol of destiny, to become a grotesque reflection of divine justice. In some places, the condemned were even displayed at crossroads, another potent symbol where law, fate, and punishment met. By the High Middle Ages, the wheel was entrenched in European legal culture. France, Germany, the Low Countries, and parts of Scandinavia all used it as a form of exemplary punishment. It was reserved for the worst crimes: aggravated murder, banditry, rebellion, and sometimes heresy. The condemned might suffer a death that lasted not minutes, but hours, or even days, if the executioner was skilled in prolonging pain. The wheel was no longer a crude tool of war. It had become a ritual of state power. The transition from battlefield to scaffold was complete. What began as improvisation in ancient wars had become the centerpiece of public squares. And with this transformation, the wheel took on a new life, not merely as a weapon, but as a terrifying emblem of authority. The next stage in its dark journey would make it infamous: the carefully orchestrated step-by-step destruction of the human body. The breaking wheel was not merely a tool of execution, it was a system of destruction, perfected over centuries, to inflict the maximum agony while parading the victim's body as a grotesque warning. To understand its impact, we must dissect its use step by step, as both a machine of pain and a ritual of power. The condemned was first led into the square, often stripped to the waist, sometimes naked, depending on local custom. The crowd was already waiting, pressed tight in anticipation. The wheel itself, a wagon wheel reinforced with iron bands, was laid flat on the ground or mounted upon a scaffold. Nearby stood the executioner, armed with his instrument of choice, a heavy iron cudgel or hammer. The victim was bound, limbs spread wide, tied to wooden beams or directly positioned alongside the wheel's spokes. This was no random arrangement. Execution manuals prescribed precise methods. The arms and legs were stretched out, the joints exposed, ready for the blows that would follow. The executioner raised the iron cudgel and brought it down with brutal accuracy. The first strike typically shattered the shin or forearm, bones snapping like dry branches. Blow after blow followed, wrists, elbows, knees, thighs. The sound was unforgettable, a wet crack, followed by screams that echoed through the square. Sometimes the breaking was carried out in a predetermined sequence. Records describe the from below upwards method, where the executioner began with the legs and worked toward the arms, prolonging consciousness. In other cases, the blows alternated left and right, distributing agony evenly, ensuring the victim endured as long as possible. But not every strike was meant to kill. Skilled executioners knew how to break bones without puncturing vital organs, how to avoid the chest and skull until the very end. This ensured the condemned remained alive, aware, and suffering. Death by the wheel was often less an execution than a slow unraveling of the body. Once the bones were shattered, the victim's mangled arms and legs were often twisted through the spokes of the wheel itself. The body was interlaced with wood and iron, bent into shapes nature never intended. In some accounts, the broken man resembled a grotesque puppet, woven into the device of his torment. At this stage, the condemned was technically still alive, gasping, choking on blood, lapsing, in and out of consciousness. Some lingered for hours. A few, incredibly, were said to have survived for days, whispering prayers or curses until thirst, shock, or carrion birds finished the work. In certain jurisdictions, a final mercy blow was granted, known as the coup de grâce, the stroke of mercy. The executioner would deliver a crushing strike to the chest, throat, or skull, ending the agony. But this mercy was not always guaranteed. In many cases, the victim was left alive upon the wheel, hoisted upright for the crowd to see, condemned to die slowly from exposure, blood loss, and the predations of animals. The wheel itself was then raised on a post or set against a scaffold, turning the broken body into a macabre display. Crows circled, dogs prowled at the edges of the crowd, children pointed. This was the true purpose of the wheel, not only to destroy the criminal, but to transform him into a spectacle of deterrence. While the essence of the punishment remained the same, local traditions added variations. In France, the condemned might first be laid on a cross-shaped frame, their limbs shattered before being transferred to the wheel. In Germany, executioners sometimes arranged the broken body in the form of a grotesque St. Andrew's cross. In the Low Countries, the process could be drawn out across multiple stages: beatings, burnings, even mutilations before the wheel was applied. Occasionally, the wheel was combined with fire. Victims were broken and then set alight, their remains consumed before the crowd. In some cases, executioners spiked the shattered body to the wheel with iron nails, ensuring the display would endure long after the victim's death. This was not a private punishment. The wheel was designed for an audience. Every crack of bone, every scream, every grotesque contortion was part of the performance. For rulers and judges, the wheel was a demonstration of justice's might. For the people, it was both horror and entertainment, a grim reminder of the thin line between citizen and criminal. The ritual of the wheel forced everyone present to confront the fragility of the human body. The crowd watched as limbs bent backward, as ribs jutted through flesh, as once proud men were reduced to broken carcasses. It was law turned into theatre, punishment into pageantry. The wheel was never meant to be hidden away. It was built for eyes, for ears, for the collective gasp of a crowd as bone gave way to iron. In medieval Europe, executions were public theatre, and the breaking wheel was the most gruesome act of all. When word spread that someone was to be broken on the wheel, people gathered in droves. Merchants closed their stalls, children were hoisted onto shoulders, and peasants walked miles for the chance to see. The square became a stage, and at its center stood the condemned, frightened, defiant, or already broken inside, awaiting the torment that would both end their life and define their memory. The air carried an unsettling energy. There was dread, yes, but also excitement. Executions were not only about justice, they were about entertainment. For the ruling powers, the wheel reminded everyone who held authority. For the people, it was a spectacle, a grim diversion from daily struggle. Some cheered as the hammer fell, jeering at the condemned. Others fell silent, horrified but unable to look away. Mothers covered their children's eyes, though many peeked between their fingers. Priests urged repentance. Chroniclers scribbled furiously, noting every detail. Everyone was a participant in the ritual, whether they wanted to be or not. The executioner's role was as much performance as punishment. He wielded the hammer not only to kill, but to entertain, pacing himself so the crowd could savor the horror. He knew when to deliver a cracking blow, when to pause and let the silence hang, when to lift the body onto the wheel and present it like a grotesque trophy. The victim, too, played a role. Some screamed, pleading for mercy, others cursed their judges. A few, astonishingly, died with calm dignity, winning admiration from the crowd. Their reactions were remembered, repeated, and sometimes exaggerated in taverns for years afterward. Compared to hanging or beheading, the wheel was unmatched in its ability to hold an audience. A hanging ended in minutes. A sword stroke was instantaneous, but the wheel stretched death into a long, drawn-out drama. Every crack, every gasp, every contorted limb prolonged the story. It was suffering made into a lesson, and that lesson was clear. Crime, rebellion, and disorder would not only be punished, they would be annihilated in the most public, humiliating way possible. The crowd left not just with memories of a body, broken, but with a warning etched into their minds. The wheel spares no one. The breaking wheel turned execution into an art of fear, a ritual where justice was less about law and more about performance, where the line between punishment and cruelty vanished. And in this theater of death, rulers found their greatest ally, the terror of the people. History remembers names not only for their deeds, but for the way they died, and few deaths left a mark as deep as those endured on the wheel. The breaking wheel was more than punishment. It was a stage upon which infamous criminals, rebels, and legends met their end. Take the case of Peter Niers, a name whispered with fear in 16th century Germany. He was no ordinary thief. Niers was accused of witchcraft, of black magic, of murdering pregnant women to harvest the bodies of their unborn children. Tales claimed he consumed human flesh, storing hearts in jars, as part of his diabolical rituals. Whether fact or exaggeration, it hardly mattered. When he was captured in 1581, the people demanded not just justice, but horror. His fate was sealed. Niers was tortured for days before the wheel finally claimed him. His body was shattered limb by limb, displayed to satisfy a crowd who believed they were watching evil itself destroyed before their eyes. Another infamous figure was Matthias Klostermaier, known as the Bavarian Robin Hood. A notorious bandit leader in the 18th century, he stole from the wealthy and became a hero among peasants who hated their lords. But for the authorities, Klostermaier represented rebellion, chaos, and a dangerous kind of fame. When captured, he was condemned to the wheel, not simply to kill him, but to erase his legend. Witnesses recorded how his bones were crushed methodically, his body broken until nothing of the fearless outlaw remained. Only a mangled warning nailed to the wheel, swaying in the wind. And then there is the legend of St. Catherine of Alexandria. According to tradition, she was condemned to die on the wheel for defying a Roman emperor. Yet the story says the wheel shattered at her touch, destroyed by divine power, sparing her from its torment. Though she was later beheaded, the wheel became forever tied to her name, transformed into a paradoxical symbol of both martyrdom and cruelty. Churches carried the Catherine wheel in their iconography, even as real wheels were splintering, the bones of criminals in the streets below. These cases reveal the dual nature of the wheel. It destroyed villains, yes, but it also tried to break heroes. It was used against men who terrified peasants and against women who inspired the faithful. Each story carried a message crafted by those in power. The wheel was not just for justice, but for propaganda. When Peter Niers was shattered, the wheel declared victory over the demonic. When Matthias Klostermaier was broken, the wheel crushed rebellion. When St. Catherine resisted, the wheel became a symbol of faith's triumph over tyranny. Each case ensured that the wheel was more than a tool of death. It was a storyteller, weaving narratives of sin, rebellion, holiness, and punishment. And as these stories spread across villages and cities, the wheel gained a legend of its own, a legend built on broken bones and shattered lives. The wheel was not only iron and wood, it was a symbol, a haunting emblem that carried meaning far beyond the scaffold. To die upon the wheel was to become part of a story, one written in the language of faith, fate, and fear. In Christian Europe, punishment was never just about crime, it was about the soul. Executions carried a spiritual weight, presented as divine justice made visible. The wheel, with its endless turning spokes, was tied to the idea of fate itself, the rise and fall of men under God's will. To be broken on the wheel was to be cast down, crushed not only by law, but by destiny. Yet even in its horror, the wheel became a paradoxical symbol of holiness. The legend of Saint Catherine transformed it into the Catherine wheel, an icon carried in church windows and saintly images. Here was a saint who defied the emperor, who faced the breaking wheel without fear, only for the device to shatter at her touch. Her story turned an instrument of terror into a sign of divine power. Still, for ordinary people, the association lingered. Every time they saw a Catherine wheel carved in stained glass or painted in a chapel, they were reminded of the death that waited for criminals in the square. Heraldry adopted the wheel as well. Noble families displayed it on their coats of arms, a chilling reminder that their authority extended to life and death. The wheel stood as both a badge of honor and a threat. To those who opposed them, the message was clear: resist, and your body may one day hang shattered on our symbol. But the wheel carried other meanings too, darker, more primal. In folklore, the wheel was linked to chaos, to the eternal turning of fortune. One moment a man might rise, the next he might fall, broken and humiliated before the crowd. The wheel was not only a punishment, it was a metaphor for the fragility of human existence. And always, behind its symbolism, there was fear. Parents whispered of the wheel to their children, warning them against crime or rebellion. Priests thundered about it from pulpits, presenting it as God's judgment on earth. Even long after an execution ended, the sight of a body left twisting in the open air, picked by birds, rotting under the sun, reminded every passerby of the price of disobedience. The wheel thus lived in two worlds. In the realm of faith, it was the sign of saints and martyrs. In the realm of law, it was the crushing tool of kings. Together, they fused into a symbol that haunted the medieval imagination, a wheel that turned endlessly, carrying with it not salvation, but terror. By the dawn of the Enlightenment, the wheel was beginning to creak under the weight of changing times. For centuries, it had ruled the scaffold, but a new spirit was stirring in Europe, one that questioned cruelty, spectacle, and the need for such public displays of suffering. Philosophers and reformers began to speak against punishments that tore the body apart. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria argued that justice should be swift, certain, and measured, not sadistic. What good was a punishment that delighted the crowd, but debased the law? Slowly, the wheel began to lose its place in the machinery of power, yet it did not vanish overnight. In France, Germany, and Prussia, men were still broken on the wheel well into the 18th century. Some accounts describe crowds shrinking in size, the old fascination giving way to discomfort. What had once thrilled the masses now began to feel barbaric, a relic of a darker age. By the late 1700s, executions were transforming. The guillotine in France promised a cleaner, swifter end. Beheadings, hangings, and shootings became more common, less theatrical, but more in line with an era that prided itself on reason. The wheel, with its slow torment, seemed grotesque by comparison. Still, it lingered. In Prussia, it was used into the early 1800s. The last recorded breaking on the wheel in France occurred in 1789, the very year of the Revolution. The symbolism could not have been clearer. As the old regime crumbled, so too did its cruelest, punishment. Even as the wheel disappeared from practice, its shadow remained. Legal codes still contained its name, and villages remembered the last victims left to rot on their outskirts. Some travelers recorded stumbling upon the rusted remains of wheels in lonely fields, their spokes jutting from the earth like bones. The slow death of the wheel marked a turning point. Europe was leaving behind the age of public torture, moving, instead, toward punishments carried out behind prison walls. Justice was no longer meant to entertain. It was meant to control quietly, efficiently. But while the wheel itself stopped turning, its legend was already cemented. It had left too many scars, too many stories, too many broken bodies to be forgotten. The wheel no longer turns in our streets. No crowds gather, No hammers rise and fall, no bones splinter beneath iron spokes. Yet the memory of the wheel endures, as vivid and unsettling as the day its last victim drew breath. Why does it linger? Perhaps because the wheel embodies the darkest contradiction of human history, the blending of justice with cruelty, of law with sadism. It was never just about killing. It was about making death a message, a performance, a warning carved into both body and memory. The image of the wheel still haunts us. In museums, rusted remnants of its frames sit behind glass, silent yet heavy with echoes. In art and folklore, it appears as a symbol of fate, punishment, and divine wrath. Even in our language, the phrase "broken on the wheel" survives, a chilling reminder of what it meant to be utterly destroyed. But the fascination goes deeper. We look back at the wheel not only with horror, but with a strange, morbid curiosity. What did it feel like to stand in that crowd? To watch a man's life end in fragments? To hear the crack of bone, the cries of agony, the silence after the final blow? These questions trouble us because they force us to confront an uncomfortable truth: that human beings have always been drawn to the spectacle of suffering. The wheel was a mirror. It reflected the power of kings and emperors, the fears of ordinary people, the hunger for order in a world of chaos. But it also revealed something darker: our capacity to turn death into entertainment and pain into theater. Today, the breaking wheel is gone, buried with the brutality of the past. Yet its shadow remains. In every fascination with true crime, in every retelling of dark history, in every shiver we feel when imagining those scenes, the wheel still turns, in memory, in imagination, in the stories we cannot stop telling. The wheel of bones may no longer crush flesh, but it continues to crush history. And in its echo, we are reminded of how thin the line is between justice and cruelty, between order and sadism, between humanity and the abyss.